Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture on Chapter 4, which is discussing marketing research in the sports industry. And I want you to think about all the different opportunities for points of purchase that exist within the sports industry. Sports fans and consumers at any given time can spend money on an array of different goods and services. So we want to understand how much are people truly willing to pay from the sports marketing side of the house. So readily available data have really empowered stronger decision making in some of these areas. And I want you to think about everything that goes into actually creating a product to put on the market. How do we know what to charge for it? How do we know how much to produce? How do we know what individuals will purchase? And be willing to spend on that purchasing. So there's a very systematic way that companies and product developers go about understanding the market before they even have those products really truly produced on the factory line. So we need to make sure that in this chapter we understand how we get that data, who produces that data for us to analyze, and then also how to really interpret that information so that we can basically not go bankrupt. And it's going to be able to tell us how much to produce and a price point that would be appropriate for what the market is telling us is appropriate. So this chapter really looks at a couple different objectives that I've already mentioned. First is to become aware of the different sources of data and information available within the sports industry, and also how businesses go about obtaining and collecting that information. We also want to understand which business functions benefit the most from data-driven decision making. And then finally, we want to understand how the sport industry uses market research methodologies in daily business activities through looking at a couple different case studies presented here in your textbook. So let's jump right into looking at sports market research. The term market research in this book is going to sound exactly what it is: research on the market. And a market researcher's job really involves providing insight and wisdom about consumers in the brand's target market. So within the sport industry, we're talking about market research is then defined as the provision of insight and information specifically about sports fans. So what kind of sources of information are out there? We're going to be talking first about syndicated data, but we're also going to be looking at custom research. In regards to syndicated data, we actually have some very large companies that assist in the collection, in the organization, and the publication of information for actual consumption by other corporations. So this is considered data that has been collected, organized, and repackaged for consumption. What we have to understand is this is very beneficial to smaller companies that don't have the time and the money or the resources to really interview, to survey, to do research with very, very large groups of the population. So they have a source that provides them this information. So there's companies, your textbook talks about companies named NPD, there's a Nielsen company, there's an IRI that basically does all the research in massive numbers, and then they package it and then they sell it. They sell it in a couple different ways. They produce syndications or magazines that have this information, and they also downright sell the data to certain companies. The downside to this for smaller companies is the fact that the information might not be as specific to their type of market as they would hope for it to be. But again, the upside is that you've got this very large company that's doing this information, doing the legwork, and spending that type of money so that they don't have to. Because if we didn't have these type of companies, manufacturers would really have to spend an inordinate amount of money on consumer studies that would actually lack even sufficient sample size for what they're trying to do. So syndicated data can be very advantageous. One of the largest sources of syndicated information actually comes from the U.S. Census that the United States performs about every 10 years. The cool thing about the census is that it's available online free of charge, and even over the recent years they've revamped the data presentation as kind of a more user-friendly way for researchers or any other interested parties that have any basic computer skills to access the information. Another source of information for maybe smaller groups is groups called Scarborough and Simmons, and also your book talks a lot about ESPN, how they gather their own syndicated research. So these are three different groups that are also out there in addition to the U.S. Census, because the census doesn't really fulfill all the needs related to syndicated data. So you've got two different companies, Scarborough and Simmons, and they actually provide more of a detailed overview of the U.S. population than the U.S. Census does. And they really tailor their offerings to specific clients by looking at the population as a set of consumers. So it's really interesting because Scarborough's tactics to measure clientele, they do phone interviews, survey booklets, television diaries, internet surveys, and what they do is they take all this information. They want to know about a lot of consumer habits, such as where they buy their cars, where they bank, what kind of drink do they consume, what's their health care, what lifestyle do they lead, what restaurants do they like to eat at, all these different things, and put them out there on a database through the web. And additionally, they release this information in 2 annual data files with very recent information. Simmons does something very, very similar to Scarborough's. So if you look at page 90 on table 4.1, they show you an example of the data collected by, I believe, Scarborough, and it compares auto products and services in regards to shopping habits of adults aged 18 to 49. So this is true demographic profiling by not only Simmons and Scarborough, but also by ESPN. They're kind of what the self-proclaimed leader of worldwide sports. We happen to be right down the road from ESPN headquarters over at Wide World of Sports and Disney. But they really profile sports fans and look at their interests and behaviors and preferences specifically within the United States. Moving on to audience measurement. One of the biggest companies that's responsible for helping decide the commercial prices for spots like for the Super Bowl or for March Madness is the Nielsen Company. And the reason that they're so big is because they have a complete understanding of audience ratings, because they play a substantial role in sponsorship rights negotiations. So Nielsen looks at mostly TV ratings, and what they do is recruit large samples of households, representative of all households in the country who own a television, and they use a device called people meters. And this is actually attached to a television set, and then the panelists indicate which members of the household watch the respective programming. So this is how a certain company gets its data on television viewing. And what they do is they monetize the business through paid subscription for its services, because the clients all across industries are very, very concerned with TV viewership. And in the sport market, in particular, properties want to know to price advertising slots for sponsors and brands that buy ad space during related programming. So if you look on page 92, you've got table 4.3. This is an example of Nielsen output for primetime network TV programs. Also, we can't forget how important radio marketplace needs to be understood in regards to the listenership metrics. And this is where the company Arbitron comes in. And they've done something very, very similar to what Nielsen has done in regards to analyzing the television market. Another important company that's really looked at digital media is ComScore, and they have come up with something called a mobile metrics solution, and this is something that provides usage data across mobile devices and mobile apps on smartphones. So yes, they are out there, they are watching us, they are watching our trends, they're packaging it, they're selling it to companies, and that's how companies and teams and sports teams determine in part how they're going to price certain products. And then finally, let's talk about broadcast exposure. Joyce Julius and Repucom are the ones that are really kind of responsible for coming up with this formula to be able to determine how much signage is worth in an event. So when we're talking about sponsorship signage within a TV camera sightline, this is typically considered premium and inventory. And how do we assign that dollar value, for the benefit of seeing an individual drink Gatorade on the sideline during a match. And there's a methodology that counts the minutes or even the seconds of exposure that a brand gets during a game or even a broadcast and applies a conversion factor to estimate the advertising equivalent value. So in other words, a comparison is made between the cost of buying standard advertising time and the exposure gained through the particular sponsorship. And again, so this is kind of where Julius and Replicom have kind of taken the market in regards to what is the average going price for something like putting a billboard up in the outfield. So now the next couple of slides discusses custom research, and I'm really hoping that some of these concepts in regards to custom research stand out to you and sound very familiar, because a lot of this goes back to our peer-reviewed research conversations that we've had in multiple classes, especially in the lower division wheel. So when I talk about custom research, I'm talking about customized methodology and collection of data for use by a specific source. So this is something that you can kind of relate back to for doing a scientific experiment and a hypothesis that a researcher has. This is something that produces primary data. In other words, this data has not already been pre-collected with a certain company and bought, or that it's available for usage. This is a question that a researcher or that a marketer wants to know about their market or about their product. They have a very specific question that they've designed and they perform the research themselves. Custom research of consumers falls into one of two categories, and again, these should be familiar to you as either quantitative or qualitative data. So in regards to the methods of custom research data collection, typically quantitative surveys can be done online, through intercepts, through telephone, through direct mail. Again, you're able to take this information and talk about quantities involved. There's usually numbers involved with quantitative research. There's also qualitative interactions, and this is typically done through interviews with focus groups or ethnographies. Again, qualitative leads back to quality, so this is very descriptive in nature, and typically you have to, once you do an interview, if you're not recording it, you have to transcribe it into probably a Word document or maybe even into an Excel spreadsheet, and that also actually kind of makes it a little bit quantitative as well. But again, remember the difference between quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative deals with numbers and statistics. Qualitative deals with descriptive words to describe something. So, you know, quantitative would be counting the number of soccer balls on a field, versus qualitative would be, what did the soccer ball look like? Was it black and white, or was there a pattern on it? And that kind of gives you a good example of the differentiation between the two. And then there are also other qualitative sources out there. Social media. You know, how is the team described as looking today? Did they perform at their best, or were they having a subpar performance? And there's also, you know, business to business research as well. When you're doing online surveys specifically, there are some benefits and there are some drawbacks in regards to market research. The benefits to doing an online survey would be that there's readily available information to access in regards to individuals that are out there. Most of us have some sort of mobile device or computer technology at home that we can take a simple survey and submit rather quickly. It's readily available survey design software. If any of you guys have used SurveyMonkey, it's free. It's relatively simple to use, to learn as well. Your online surveys can target specific participants, especially if you have their email addresses as part of their registration. And it provides you quick access to the data. But there are some limitations to performing these online surveys. It's like I said earlier, if you have their email address, it's great, but if you don't, it's kind of hard to reach them individually. It also can be blocked by potential participants. If they get the survey in the email and they think you know, they don't have the time to fill it out, or they actually do click on the link and realize that you're asking them 20 or 30 questions, they're going to bounce that and say, nope, I don't have time to participate in your survey. And that kind of leads us to the next point then, is it can sometimes produce relatively low response rates. If you are performing a survey that's in person, face to face, you're much likely going to get your answers versus someone that has the survey, and they're in front of their computer, and all of a sudden the doorbell rings and they get up to answer the doorbell, and then they forgot to go back to the survey, or just decide that they don't want to participate in it anymore. So there are appropriate times to do online surveys. There are more appropriate times to do things like interviews, whether it's in a group setting or a one-on-one setting as well. Intercepts, let's talk about intercepts. Using the methodology of intercepts is kind of a combination of using an online survey and doing a personal interview. If you have ever attended a Magic game, or if you've been to any of the Orlando City games or Orlando Pride matches, their sports marketers are very present. Number one, they want to be there to provide information, but there's also lots of people that are out with handheld devices trying to stop you and ask you questions. So that's an example of an intercept. They target consumers in a specific location. So if you're at the Amway, if you are at Camping World Stadium, or if you're actually at the Orlando City Stadium, they are out there in force with those handheld devices, and they're looking to stop you. I've been stopped at Disney, right there as you walk into the gates. They have customer service employees that are standing there waiting to stop you and ask you about your experience for the day. So that can be very effective because you're using some component of a mobile device or online survey, but then you've got someone right there in front of you asking questions, hopefully keeping your attention for just a few brief seconds while they enter the information for you on their handheld device. If this is a strategy that you choose to employ, maybe for your class project, here are some effective tips for effective data collection in the intercept method. Make sure that you're a very objective and an unbiased staff in unbranded attire. In other words, if you are standing there in your full Orlando Pride regalia and you're asking about a fan's experience, they might not answer you honestly because they know that you're from that organization, and that might sway an individual's answers and responses. So if you are going to employ this and you're associated with a certain group, it's probably best to go and look like a neutral party. Also, employ an adequate number of interviewers. If you're going to a very large venue where there are lots of people, obviously the more individuals you utilize as intercepts, the more information you'll be able to collect. Likewise, if you're going to a very small venue, you're not going to bring 30 people deep with you to act as intercepts. Bring the appropriate number of interviewers to the appropriate venue or site. Also, something that I've learned a lot in my doctoral studies is to keep the questionnaire short and brief. Kind of put yourself in the consumer's shoes. If you get stopped walking into Disney, or if you get stopped walking around at an Orlando City match, it's probably very likely that the individual doesn't want to be talking to you for very long. You're more likely to get an adequate number of responses if you keep your survey short, simple, and to the point. And then the final tip is to have the staff use some sort of sampling scheme. And sampling scheme, what we mean by that is making sure, in order to keep a random sample of who you're talking to, a rule of thumb could be, all right, you're going to talk to every fifth person that you see. We have to be very aware of our own personal biases if we are the actual intercepts, because it might be very possible that you might be only looking for the good-looking men to interview, or the good-looking women to interview, or maybe you're simply more comfortable talking to someone that look similar to you. And that can be dangerous because we're not getting a true sample of everyone that's present. So coming up with some sort of scheme to select who you're going to interview can help be more representative of the general population that is present. Telephoning. Telephoning is another way to collect data. It actually has been not as heavily used over the last frequent years, simply because of the do not call list. Also, participants' phone numbers are often easier to access than email addresses sometimes, but we know that through the caller ID that someone that has a random phone number pop up on their phone wouldn't be as likely to answer the phone. You can use random digit dialing. It works sometimes, it doesn't work all the time. Mail is another way Unfortunately, again, declined in popularity. It requires additional labor to input the data after the responses are mailed. The response rate is generally often low, but it does offer respondents assurance of confidentiality, um, which can be beneficial. Let's talk about the difference very quickly between confidential and anonymous. Confidential means the researcher is aware of who answered that question, but they're agreeing not to share that personal information in the survey results. Anonymous is where the researcher does not know who has filled the survey out. So there is a difference. And when you go to build your survey, however it is, whether it's through intercepts, whether it's through an online survey, or whether it's during an interview, you need to be very careful of talking to the consumer that you're speaking with, and explaining to them whether your survey is confidential or whether it's anonymous. Now, obviously, if you're doing an in-person interview, it's impossible for you to say that it will be anonymous because you're sitting right there in front of the person, you know who it is. So in that manner, you would be promising that individual confidentiality when you report the results. But again, when we're talking about mail, telephone and mail, using those type of methods to collect market research has typically declined in the past couple years. Interviews. Sometimes interviews can be the most effective way to gather your data. It depends on the situation. The positives is that it helps extract deeper and more detailed information and data. It can be very cost effective depending on the organization's objectives. It's very important for the interview to use some sort of discussion guide. In other words, have a plan of attack before you go in. Have your questions listed before you go in. Interviewing an individual can be very challenging because it's your responsibility as the interview to listen more than you talk. This is an opportunity for someone to talk to you and for you to be recording and maybe writing down their responses. As you progress through this class and as you progress through the eventual program, when you go to collect your information, if you're doing an interview, I would highly recommend that you practice your interview with maybe a spouse, maybe your brother or sister, a parent, someone that you have at home, to allow yourself an opportunity to practice being silent. It sounds silly, it sounds like it's pretty simple, when in actuality, when you get put into that situation, we find that sometimes we're trying to make the other person feel so comfortable in the situation that we want to talk to make them feel comfortable. So interviewing definitely takes practice. The location of an interview can also affect responses. If someone is so kind as to grant an interview with you, try and select a neutral site. Or if that's not possible, select a site that would put the interviewee at the most level of comfort. Typically, if I'm contacting an individual requesting an interview, I tell them that I will come to them. I will sit in their office. That puts them kind of in charge of the situation because they're in their own environment, and that makes them feel more comfortable come time to answer my questions. But if they don't want to do that, then find a neutral location. Definitely don't look for a location where you're sitting behind your desk and you look all official and they feel intimidated. That's going to impede some of their answers that they want to give to you. And so that's why when we talk about it's best to use a third party or a neutral discussion leader. Sometimes we can't always do that because we are the ones that are having to gather the information. But in that situation, again, you would want to be very neutral as possible. Wear very neutral clothing brands. If I'm doing research for Kaiser University and I'm needing to interview Kaiser students, I might not want to wear my Kaiser department chair name tag. I might want to take that off for a little bit so they don't feel like I'm someone that's over them and that they're intimidated to give certain answers to. Focus groups. These are also a form of interview that can be done with groups, anywhere between 5 to 12 participants. If this is something that you're going to utilize, make sure the groups are very homogeneous to encourage comfort. And the focus groups really should allow for observation of nonverbal cues. Again, whoever's leading the discussion for focus groups need to be neutral in nature, and they really truly need to facilitate a discussion and listen. The facilitation is for the individuals that are participating and allowing them to speak. Your job, if you are leading a focus group, again, is to listen and to observe nonverbal cues of body language. Ethnography. Ethnography is actually watching a participant in their real life situation, so in their average everyday life. So this is the act of observing respondents in their real life environment. This can actually provide deep insight into customers' needs states, their habits, their decision-making processes, but the downside of it is that they don't always act the same when they understand that they're being actively observed. It can also require a long time to be able to perform the research. And sometimes the subject doesn't feel very natural in that situation. So we understand with ethnography that it's very, very important that there's a built trust with the participants, and that they feel very natural and unaffected during the research process. Otherwise, the data that we're collecting won't be accurate. So who are the users of sport market research? Your book explains 3 different groups that really look at the information through sport market research. We're going to discuss professional sports leagues, professional sport properties or teams, and then we're also going to discuss sponsors. Research typically is not held a regular role in a typical sports organization. Usually, the research has been done by a tenured marketed researcher sourced from an outside vendor or some sort of third party. This particular person was academically trained, they were well versed in research, but there's actually been a moving trend within recent years to use market research to drive day-to-day business decisions and functions within sport. So jobs that are available with sports teams, with leagues, things of that language, there isn't a typical market researcher or analyst anymore. The jobs have become very specific in nature. And in just a second, we're going to talk about how important it is to perform the right kind of research to really get the right information that you're looking for. But for the time being, let's jump into the 3 different users of sport market research. In regards to professional sports league, all major sport leagues employ media researchers. They do a couple different things. They mine ratings data to really support the right fees and advertising fees charged. They often satisfy the internal consumer research needs across many departments, and they also serve in the role of an advisor or consultant to its member clubs. The use of market research on a day-to-day basis at the professional sport property level has grown substantially over the past 5 years. They do a couple of different things. Actually, they do a lot of research, but some main topics are collecting fan feedback, doing ticket pricing studies to analyze appropriate ticket prices, what price point will result in unsold tickets, what price point will damage the perceived value of a ticket. They also want to be able to justify fees and measures of an effective corporate partnership to maintain those types of relationships. And in regards to sponsors, the primary objective of sports sponsorship is to use the assets of the property to drive the business objectives of the sponsor more effectively than it could without the sponsorship. And market research related to sponsorship varies greatly according to the type of market, the sport involved, and also the company that's willing to perform the sponsorship. So there are challenges involved. They really do have to identify baseline key performance indicators before initiating that research and analysis. And again, talking about performing the right research, it's very important to conduct research and to do it in vivo, not just after an event or a team has concluded their season. There must be adequate resources enabled to perform market research efforts. We have to understand the business objectives at hand. We have to let the objective define the methodology, never vice versa. Planning is key in performing the right research. We have to understand the question before we can even begin to imagine planning the methodology. It's important to understand that we have a budget and how to stay within those limitations before moving forward, and then to make sure that we're getting the right research partner and not just a supplier, not just someone that's funding the research. So there can be some very key things that must be in place in order for the right research to be conducted. The rest of your chapter is talking about case studies in regards to how market research can be used throughout the sport industry to facilitate data-driven decision making. You guys know how important it is for us to collect data. If you guys come up with any terms or any ideas, what do I always ask you? Show me the research. And you can bet your bottom dollar that anyone that's looking to spend money for a product or to promote some sort of sports team is going to ask you before you get started with your plan, prove what you say to me is going to work, and that's where your data comes into play. So definitely take some time to look at these case studies. They look at sponsorship through the Milwaukee Bucks. They talk about ticketing with the Seattle Sounders. They look at the Las Vegas Motor Speedway, and then they also talk about, again, they end the PowerPoint with performing the right research. So read those in depth. And again, I always encourage you look at the activities at the end of the chapter to kind of help you solidify concepts from Chapter 4. Chapter 5, in the next lecture, we'll talk about market segmentation, which is helping us appreciate the role of segmentation in the marketing process in order to match the right product to the correct target or consumer. And that's where we'll pick up next time in Chapter 5.